On this podcast, you'll find interviews with high-performing, successful individuals in life sciences. On a weekly basis, we cover their proven methods, principles, strategies, and mindsets to implement new technologies that scale to meet the needs of people in our world.
This week on the Life Science Success Podcast, my guest is Tom Denison. His passion is mentoring, advising, and funding biotech startups. He's engaged with over 200 startups at all stages from concept to exit. Tom is the founder and chief relationship officer of SmartHealth Catalyzer, the hub for the Midwest biotech venture creation. SmartHealth builds biotech startups around extraordinary biotechnology being developed at Midwest universities and research hospitals. It is my pleasure to welcome Tom Denison to the podcast.
Welcome, Tom.
Good to see you, Don.
Great to see you as well.
And happy to be here.
Yeah. So I'm really excited with Tom, with your background and things like that. I love the ability to dive in a little bit more in terms of your career and kind of what led you here. So can you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so it's probably a bit of an unusual path, but happy to give you an idea of how I arrived here. So going way back post-college, I started out in publishing, way back when people actually read magazines, like paper stuff.
No way.
Yeah, seriously. But then this crazy internet thing came along, and I'm like, that looks pretty interesting. I think I'll jump in head first, which, by the way, is how I typically do anything. So anyway, I ended up being a part of 3 tech startups here in Chicago, which is where I live. And very fortunate with those startups. They all 3 ended up succeeding. And then from there, spent some time in e-commerce and ran a top 200 e-commerce company, invested a bit, and then sold that. So a total of 4 exits at that point. And that really allowed me to step back and focus on what I really love, and that's mentoring and advising early stage founders. And at the time, it was purely tech startup founders. And by the way, this was about the time that Chicago was emerging as really a tech innovation hub. Love them or hate them, it was about the same time as Groupon coming out, a little bit later, Grubhub, and some other very notable tech startups. So there was a lot of activity going on in Chicago, and I basically just opened myself up to early stage founders and no real agenda and just helping them as best I could. So I ended up working with really hundreds of startups, early stage startups, from literally concept all the way through to exit.
Wow.
And everything in between. So I have to tell you, it was an interesting experience because I probably got more out of it in many instances than my actual mentee, simply because there, at least at the time, there was really no school of mentorship.
Right.
So like many things, just learn it the hard way just by doing it. But it really helped me personally and just develop in how to work with founders. And then fast forward maybe half a dozen years, so about 6.5 years ago, I just had this very serendipitous experience where I was meeting with the president and the head of research at the small medical school in Chicagoland. It's called Rosalind Franklin University. By the way, it's the only medical school in the country named after a woman. And I hope at least some of your listeners know who Rosalind Franklin is. She's the oft overlooked co-discoverer of the double helix in DNA. Anyway, they were just at a time that they were starting to contemplate bio-entrepreneurship and building startups and tech transfer and all those kinds of things, and really knew nothing about startups at all. And they had asked me to meet with like 7 or 8 of their scientists. And I'm like, you realize I'm not a scientist, right? I don't know how any of this stuff works. And they did. And I told them that I typically look at any startup through a very narrow lens. I just think about 2 things. I think about, does this innovation, whatever it is, solve a real problem? And will somebody at some point in time pay for it? And so they got that. And I said, okay. So I met with these 7 or 8 scientists and battling my way through 48 slide presentations, very academic and so on. But I got it. And there were 2 in particular that blew me away. Just the research that they had conducted thus far, validating their original hypothesis and all of that. It was really phenomenal. But here's the thing. And this was a pivotal moment for me personally. It was very clear that there was no way their research would ever see the light of day. And no fault of their own. These are pure academics working on stuff that could be life-saving, life-changing, biotechnology. But the reality is just the way that our professor at any university is rewarded is based upon publishing and grants and tenure and all of those things. So there's this I discovered, but I'm sure for most of your listeners, this is not revelational, but it was to me at the time, that we've got all these brilliant scientists at universities and research hospitals that are coming up with this stuff, but the likelihood of the vast majority of that research being done it'll never see the light of day. And that just really bothered me.
So in terms of the next steps for you, so what did you do overall then in terms of your next steps to help them?
I thought about, and again, this is not the lens that I look at life through, is I think of a very much a startup mentality. So it was clear to me what the problem was. And it's just what I mentioned, is that you've got these brilliant scientists that really have no clue about how to create a startup and really spin something out. And I'm speaking very generally. Of course, there are exceptions. But then also, too, I just want to add this, is that the problem was really heightened in the Midwest. Everyone knows where the vast majority of attention and capital is being paid, and that's on the coasts.
Right.
It's Boston, Cambridge, and San Francisco, Silicon Valley, San Diego, and so on. And realistically, the Midwest is flyover country when it comes to biotech. So all of that kind of collectively really bothered me. So I thought about, all right, know nothing about life sciences, nothing about biotech, but I do know about creating something that solves a problem. And we've certainly identified the problem. So as you're suggesting, how do we solve for that? So the foundation of everything that we're doing today was really built upon our proximity. So we're actually right in the center of the largest biotech pharma cluster in the Midwest. So we've got huge companies like Abbott and AbbVie and Baxter and Horizon and Hollister and on and on. There's literally over 30,000 people that work in pharma and biotech right around us. So we have this nice pool of people and pent up bio-entrepreneurship. So I just started tapping into that as I do. And one thing I want to add is that I built up this philosophy over time that I meet with somebody new each and every day that I've never met with before, that I think is interesting and potentially interested in helping us solve this problem. And so I've done that over the past 6.5 years. And from that kind of built up this community of people that, again, I call them bio-entrepreneurs, but these are people that on average have about 30 years experience and expertise across anything you can imagine in the development of some sort of research, from concept all the way through to commercialized new drug or diagnostic or what have you. And so today we call it the ops team, short for operations, because that's the missing link. These great innovations coming out of these universities, but really what's lacking is operations. And as biotech is incredibly challenging, more so than probably any other industry or vertical, in that you've got regulatory and research challenges and so on. Anyway, so we've built up this huge team now. It's just counted a couple of days ago, it's 179 people.
Wow. On
this team. And then on top of that, we built up this sort of network, if you will, of Midwest universities and research hospitals So we are now working directly with 35 Midwest universities, and you would know all of them, from Northwestern, University of Chicago, Michigan, Illinois, Ohio State, Iowa, Wisconsin, WashU, and so on. And then also with Mayo Clinic and Cleveland Clinic. And we are tapped into the most prolific institutions, and then within those institutions, the most prolific investigators, scientists that are coming up with innovations and new IP, intellectual property, and so on. So essentially what we're doing is, and I guess you could sum up all of this into 4 short words, it's Midwest biotech venture creation. So we look for what we believe to be very promising biotechnology being developed at any one of those institutions. And when we find something, when we discover a discovery that we think is promising, essentially we look to build, and this is the key word, build a startup around that innovation.
Yeah. So I'm going to come back just to a couple of things that you said early on. So in terms of the sort of right technology, right? How do you make that decision? Who helps you make the decision, or how do you evaluate those things?
That's a very good question. If we think about this in terms of a funnel.
Yep.
And by the way, I use that metaphor quite a bit. And then, of course, a scientist on our ops team pointed out to me that he's like, Tom, funnel, whatever you put in the top comes out the bottom. Like what you're really referring to is a filter funnel. And I'm like, oh, thank you. Okay. Anyway, so if you imagine at the top of the funnel are all of these institutions, and then the top scientists at each one of those institutions. And so at the very top of that funnel, it really starts with the who. Like, who is the shooting star at whatever institution that is on this meteoric rise in terms of their discoveries and publishing and all of that, or who's got a big lab and gets lots of NIH grant funding and all those things. So we can start there. And then we take a look at what is it that they're working on. And this is where it starts to get really interesting. So through that ops team, we have all this expertise and everything from IP, preclinical, clinical, commercial, regulatory, manufacturing, you name it. We have all the expertise needed to determine if something is worthwhile pursuing. And we actually have 5 stages of due diligence.
Wow.
So yeah, it's pretty crazy. And in mid stage, we have this small collective of folks. I think we used to call it the table of 5 appropriately because there were 5 people, but I think now there's 7 people. So I guess it would be the table of 7. But in any case, it's a checkpoint. We've got a biotech VC in there. We've got someone who used to run corporate venture capital at a big pharma company. We've got some brilliant folks on this smaller team just to say, are we crazy or what? And so if we determine, okay, this looks good, this looks promising, then it goes to what we call a deep dive due diligence. And this is where it gets really interesting. We'll put together a due diligence team for each opportunity. And typically it'll be around 5 or 6 people on that team, and each covering off on different areas of expertise. Again, IP, regulatory, preclinical. Maybe we can also bring in KOLs as needed and so on. Given the size of our ops team, the network we have collectively is enormous. So I feel like if we don't have the expertise immediately on our team, we can get to it. And if we can't, I don't think it exists. That's how I feel, because we have this collective network of people that's extraordinary. But so that deep dive due diligence team will spend 7 or 8 weeks taking a look at the opportunity. And to give you an idea, in 2020, we looked at 120. So the top of the funnel, we looked at 125 opportunities. We did a deep dive on 10, and we licensed 1.
Wow. So your input numbers got to be really big overall to get to a decent output number then in terms of the numbers of companies that you're going through overall. That's a tremendous amount of work, but it also, I find it interesting to hear how broad your network is as well, with 179 potential ops people focused on these things as well.
Yeah, I mentioned early on that the foundation was built upon our proximity. And of course, then this COVID thing came along and folks were much more open and agreeable to meeting and chatting as we are right now. And so while the foundation of the ops team is proximal, really today, there are folks scattered around the US, coast to coast, Minneapolis to Boca Raton, Florida, and everything in between. And the reality is that we're focused on innovation coming out of the Midwest.
Right.
We're building virtual companies. So ultimately, it doesn't really matter where the ops team folks are.
Sure.
Arguably, they could be anywhere in the world. So in many ways, like a lot of initiatives out there, COVID has been our growth. It can be attributed to COVID, quite frankly, an unfortunate way to arrive at growth. But anyway, it is what it is. So that's how I think going into 2020, we had fewer than 100 people on the ops team, and now we have 179. Yeah, so that's allowed us to grow. But you're right, it does require a lot of opportunities at the top of the funnel. But again, I think about, and we perpetually have this outlook and thinking about everything we do is behaving as a startup. So along the way, we're perpetually trying to improve what we do.
Right.
So there are endless opportunities. It's just a matter of how quickly we can move things through our funnel.
So with that in mind, I guess the one other question I would have in terms of your operation, right? So you go through the evaluation. Interestingly enough, as I interact more and more with smaller startups, there are a lot of basic things that they don't do. And that would essentially lead to a lot of the problems that they see later on, establishing good project management practices or making sure that you have good documentation around some of the things that you're doing. You don't have to do it for everything. It doesn't have to be a drastic, broad brush approach. But I'm just curious, are you starting to standardize things in your operations as well so that your team has a repeatable, you mentioned how you approach the evaluation process. Does your team then develop more of a repeatable process for other startups as well?
We have. And that actually is a very good question. And thinking about, if I were to think back even just 2.5 years ago, we were just building a process and relying upon expertise and inputs from those experts and so on. But like any startup, you realize, oh my gosh, that's not scalable. It's almost like we're trying to solve this problem with academia, yet we're acting a lot like academics doing something that is not replicable. And very interestingly and coincidentally, we've been tasked or asked by, I guess I would call them a customer of sorts. We have lots of customers, and this is a foundation. And we actually interact quite a bit with foundations. And they pose that question to us. So we have built up this process over time. And we use tools like Dropbox and Google Drive and a CRM and project management tools and things like that. But if somebody were to clearly say step 1, step 2, step 3, wasn't really documented anywhere. So we were tasked by this foundation to do just that. So it's really interesting you ask that question, because literally just over the past, it's interesting, we've taken all that we know, right, and condensed it down into, I don't know, say 15, 20 slide kind of deck.
Sure.
On what you do and how you do it and so on. And it's still, you need the expertise to fulfill certain pieces and parts of that to-do list, if you will. It's more of a roadmap.
Yeah.
And so we have, my point in all of that and answering your question is that we really have developed this highly replicable, repeatable process And yeah, and that's actually coincides with our efforts too, is that in 2021, we're looking to scale pretty dramatically. So I mentioned in 2020, out of all of that, we had 1 startup. In 2021, we'll probably have 6.
It's really good. And in terms of the background that you have and the way that you're approaching this as well, if I understand you correctly, you started with the tech background that you had, but by leveraging the resources around you, that's how you're really building a really powerful exponential approach to how you're going to take this on as well.
Yeah, so a couple things that are worth mentioning is that one, the problem that we're trying to solve is mostly, I'm sure not revelational to folks that listen to your podcast, but it really was personal for me because I grew up in an academic household. So my father is a professor. And I think I mentioned this before to you. He's one of those crazy professor types that he's in his early 80s. He retired once when he was 65, and then he retired again when he was 80, and he's now 82. And I'm sure he'll be teaching and writing and whatever forever.
Sounds like a good life to me. So
I know, I have to tell you, I tell folks, and it's interesting, when I was a kid, I think about, he always, from our perspective, was working.
Sure.
But from his perspective, it isn't work. It's just what he loves to do. So there was no, whether it was Saturday afternoon or Tuesday morning, it was just all the same. In fact, just a couple anecdotes. He wrote this book, and he actually, when he wrote the book, he flip-flopped his days. So he felt like he wrote better at night.
Yeah.
So he literally switched his days. So he would stay up all night writing and then sleep for 6 hours or whatever, go through the rest of the day. And then while everybody's going to bed, he was up all night writing. Yeah.
Well, it would be nice to have that, I guess, the quiet time at the same time, and your eyes not wishing that you were outside in the warmth or anything else, especially if you grew up somewhere in the Midwest as well.
Well, that's it. I think it was a matter of creating this kind of cocoon of focus, like just zeroing in without distractions. And to me, that's just insanity. He was that guy. And just another anecdote, he at age 78 or something had this crazy idea of doing something on the roof of his house. And unfortunately, he fell off the house. He's injured, broke some ribs and things like that, but had to stay in the hospital for a while. And while he was in the hospital, he taught a class.
Wow.
On his hospital bed, he taught a class.
Oh my.
At age 78. Yeah, that gives you an idea of just his personality. But the point being is that I grew up around this. So I totally could relate to this sort of the dynamic of, or maybe the conflict even, of entrepreneurship and academia.
Yeah.
It's oil and water, and they don't mix. But within that environment, you have all of this innovation that takes place that before I was focused on the next Snapchat. Now, in retrospect, who wants to come out with the next Snapchat? Arguably, it does more harm than good. But then this discovery of this problem that I could personally relate to in academia, I'm like, wow, man, these are things that literally could save people's lives.
Yeah, I don't know what the overall percentage for overall startups, just maybe something that you know in terms of success or failure, what those are. But I could tell you in terms of healthcare companies, it's a pretty tough road. If you number one, I don't know what the percentage of created potential technologies are that are out there. But as a person that's gone through a bit of this process of looking for technologies, I can tell you a lot of universities seem to bury them rather than highlight them. And there are good ones, but there are quite a few places where you start to look and it's worse than the worst classifieds that you might have looked at in your life. And then other places do a nice job. I mean, they highlight things nicely. They give you a quick way to search through and find things that you're looking for. But even once you've found something, now the chance of actually getting it out to where people could see it is pretty slim. Your idea of the next Snapchat, I don't know what the percentage of the success of the next Snapchat would be, but the percentage of success in this arena is a pretty tough one, right?
It really is. We have a guy on our board who used to run the venture team at a big pharma company. And he would tell his team, if we don't invest at all, we'll be right at least 95% of the time. And he's right. It is incredibly challenging. And I think it's worth noting that these aren't just, the innovations are not just widgets or something that you can just capture and package and get out the door. These are folks that have invested their entire lives into their research.
Sure.
And so the idea of some outside party coming along and saying, hey, we're here to help you get this out into the real world can be challenging.
Yeah.
And my point is that we're dealing with people, right? It's the nature of what we do. While it's biotechnology, it's people that are coming up with this stuff. And of course, there are those out there in the world that look to license something and then just turn around and sell it to somebody else or what have you. That's not our world at all. My philosophy is that because it is people, and generally in academia, those people don't really go anywhere, that it's in our interest to build a relationship with those people. It might sound a little bit of cliche, but it's building that trust and that relationship and that partnership and collaboration and so on. So that, and it's partly the recognition by the scientists that I don't know everything. And maybe I could use some regulatory help. Or, my gosh, can this actually be manufactured outside of my lab? I don't know. Maybe we should find that out. Things like that. And admittedly, there are folks that just don't buy into that at all. And again, my philosophy is, it's a pleasure to meet you. Best of luck. But I will say, though, and there are notable folks coast to coast that are very successful, the George Churches of the world or what have you, that hundreds of innovations and stuff that are spun out. But that's really the exception.
Yeah.
Not the rule. And going back to our focus on the Midwest, even if you're at University of Chicago or Northwestern or what have you, it's a challenge. It really is a challenge. And I will say, too, that it puts the university in a bit of a pickle because they want desperately to keep that professor there happy and healthy and fed and rewarded and all of that because they don't want to lose them.
Sure. But they'd also, I'm sure, like the licensing money, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's this weird sort of, I don't know how you would describe it. And then you've got this, grant funding coming in, but you don't want the professor to leave and have this big exit and go off and live on an island or something. So how do you keep them there? And it's this whole sort of conundrum around it. But
and then I look at universities like UPenn, right? I guess I'm trying to think through some of the podcasts that I've done, but it seems to be like a bunch of companies that are coming out of the Carnegie Mellons and UPenn and kind of that area of the United States anyway. And then you have other areas of the United States, like in California, where you have the things that are coming out of there. But in between there, you have a lot of places that have technologies to license that yet maybe they're just too anchored in this sort of idea around what different people will do whenever their baby more or less starts to grow up. But I look at it as a true opportunity to deliver hopefully something that might help people at the end of the day.
That's really it. And I will say too, it's really interesting to me that we work with now 37 institutions in total. And they're wildly different on how they manage internally, like supporting innovation and entrepreneurship and so on. And there are those that provide a lot of support, those that provide very little support, but it's not necessarily intentional in the lack of support. It's really being more naive on how to support. And what's interesting to me is that, and this is another part of our mission, is to try and level the playing field. Whether you're at Rosalind Franklin University or whether you're at University of Michigan, it should be an equal opportunity.
Sure.
There shouldn't be any sort of huge advantage that a Michigan has over a Rosalind Franklin University. And that's what we're trying to get at too, is that you've got all of these resources and money and grant funding and operational expertise and what have you. And why can't the scientists at Rosalind Franklin University experience the same success as someone at Wisconsin or Michigan or Ohio State or what have you? And how can we collectively share knowledge on how we do that?
Yeah.
So, something else I've done kind of ancillary to all of this, but very complementary, is there's a group called the Midwest Research University Network, and somehow finagled my way onto being on their board.
That's nice. Yeah.
But, you know, what it is, it's a collection of Midwest universities, and their constituents are tech transfer. And that's another issue at universities is tech transfer.
Right.
Wildly different people and experiences and so on across all these different universities. And why don't we have some sort of collective way of thinking about how we approach licensing and agreements and royalties and all of those things that, again, just try to level the playing field for everybody and share knowledge. Why not?
Yeah.
And I guess in some ways universities are competitive, but in other ways that should try to help each other. And
yeah, it's a not so widely known fact that the CRISPR patent, just to talk about the competitive nature of all of this, right? So the CRISPR, the overall CRISPR credit goes more or less to Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier. So that's the Nobel laureates of the technology. But whenever you look at the patent, it sits in the Broad Institute in Massachusetts, which is drastically just so confusing to me because of just understanding a little bit of this space. But also I know that things in general are competitive. However, even at the university level or wherever this stuff is making its way through seems to be very challenging from that standpoint of the competitive nature, not just in licensing technology, but also in the patent rights as well.
Oh, there's no doubt about it. And again, the irony in all of that is academics are very used to collaborating across institutions. I mean, very common. But yeah, for the IP hawks, you're like, oh my God, no, don't do that. Yeah, it's this whole kind of, through all of this, we've got this overarching problem that we're trying to solve, but there's so many other challenges within all of that makes it even more challenging, whether it is IP, even tech transfer and all of that. It just adds like another wrinkle.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. What are some of the greatest challenges that you face today? Right now with SmartHealth Catalyzer, what are some of the greatest challenges that you're seeing today? I think for us, it's still trying to get our arms around all that is there. So I mean, to put this into perspective, so you think about, let's take Mayo as an example. So Mayo will have a couple hundred, maybe 300 disclosures a year. So that means that somebody there has said, you know what, I'm onto something that's worth potentially getting patented. And that's one institution. So multiply that by 35 or 37. That's a huge amount potential innovation. Yeah. That's extraordinary and mind-boggling. Like, how do you, and that's every year. Yeah. So how do you possibly tackle that? That to me it's hard not to think about that because it's so big, but you can't necessarily get distracted by that because each and every day we're looking at different opportunities. So it's still getting our arms and minds around all of the innovation that takes place. And that's just in the Midwest. Yeah. The other thing is that I would say that when I started down this path, clearly the Midwest was considered flyover country. And that has been an ongoing challenge. I'll never forget this. I won't say who the company is or who the person is, but as a president of a notable big pharma company, and asked him how did his company go about discovering the latest, greatest, innovations.
And he said, this is pre, Uber and all that. He's like, take a taxi to O'Hare and I fly either east or west. And I'm like, what? That just, talk about a kick in the gut. I'm like, you got to be kidding. And he was here in the Midwest. And I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah.
So
it could be in your backyard. You wouldn't even have to go to O'Hare or Midway.
Exactly. And that bothered me so much. And I will say there's heightened awareness around what's happening in the Midwest. There's no doubt about it, but it's still a challenge. Easy. It's expensive, but it's easy to go to the coasts.
Sure.
It's easy to be in Boston and talk about the bumping into people, and I can always find a CEO and venture capital and blah, 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 blah. That's the easy way. We're not taking the easy way. So that is certainly still one of our biggest challenges, is just getting our minds and arms around all that we have here in the Midwest. And then how do we get more and more people interested and paying attention to what's in the Midwest? And it's happening, but it's still going to take time. And by the way, I've seen this movie before.
So did you see it with the tech companies? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Exact same thing. I started in the tech world in the 90s, and talk about being flyover country. A third largest city in the US, and Chicago is considered flyover country. I'm like, what are we talking about? But then it took time, money, and effort by a number of people to understand. And we had the ongoing problem of the brain drain. And this is specific to the tech world, but we have 3 of the top engineering schools in the world in Illinois, Purdue, and Northwestern. So those are like 3 of the top 10 in the world. But where do all those people go?
Right.
They get their gig and they go to the West Coast, and see the same sort of thing in biotech. But in any case, so it took this concerted effort, bringing together what I call the 3-legged stool, and that's innovation, operational expertise, and capital. And that's what happened. So now Chicago is a top 10 tech hub in the US and growing. It seems like almost every week there's a new unicorn that is announced in Chicago. Again, I've seen this before, and I know we can do it in biotech. And even easier, where now we don't need to have these big incubator spaces and all of that kind of stuff, and wet lab space. Although there are 3 big developments going on in Chicago as well around wet lab space. But if we're creating virtual startups, as long as the innovation is coming from here, doesn't matter.
Yeah, with these CDMOs, you can go from CMOs running a lot of the base clinical trial elements, and then you can transfer to scaling up at a CMO. And to your point, you don't need all the same infrastructure that you needed before. You still are maybe getting manufacturing space. And I've interviewed Gary McCausland here on the podcast as well, who's building a CMO in Ireland. And he just said, look, whenever he was with pharma companies, production was lumpy, and the equipment may not be used all the time, where a CMO has that opportunity to really, leverage the equipment. Yeah. There are 3 questions that I like to ask every guest. What inspires you?
Wow. Well, I will tell you something that is a bit personal, but this is absolutely the greatest inspiration, arguably, in my life. So my wife has metastatic melanoma.
Oh, wow.
But before you say anything else, she has gone through 4 treatments of immunotherapies. So Yervoy and Opdivo, but these things just were approved like 6 years ago. And she is nearly 100%. So from time of diagnosis to time of some of her sort of hot spots going away and the major tumor decreasing by over 90% is less than 6 months.
Tremendous.
Yeah. And if she had this just say pre-clinical trials 8 years ago, she would have had months to live.
Yeah.
And now it's taken months to be sure that she will live a very long and healthy life. And I can't think of anything more inspirational than that. You know, the only thing is like, how do we do it faster? Like, how do we get these things out? And she was fortunate in the terms of her response, and that the first immunotherapies targeted melanoma. So there's the most data around melanoma, which is great. But that is, so she's fortunate in timing and just her genetic makeup that she responded. But that inspires me to like, all right, so what about the people that wouldn't respond?
Sure.
And what about all the other unlimited indications that we can go after? And that's just one kind of approach.
Yeah.
You know,
Cancer is a vicious disease, and it is great to have those things for sure.
It's almost, it borders upon miraculous. And the idea is so simple in that really it's your own body.
Yeah.
Right? They're just checkpoint inhibitors. It's your own body's T cells.
Right.
There's really nothing magical about that, but that's what makes it so cool.
Yeah, it is some of the coolest science that we have, the way that people are re-instructing our own cells to say, hey, look, this is a cell that you should go after. And the next thing, our own bodies are able to go after it. Tom, what concerns you?
It's still, what concerns me is the length of time it takes to get something to patients in need. So what we do as a company with SmartHealth, and we work within this segment of development that's very early and arguably could be 24 to 36 months long. And then we're handing it off to folks that have much, much deeper pockets and all of that. But it's still, with all of that, it's still the length of time to get things out just really bothers me. Now, the good news is, if this is good news, everybody just saw something happen in a very short period of time. Yep. And let's hope that then influences the faster development and commercialization of other therapeutics.
Yeah.
I think that's what concerns me the most. And then within all of that, just to add to it, not to get political here, but I will just a little bit, is living in the United States and our kind of healthcare system. And I have a daughter that lives in Germany, and just seeing if the idea that, like going back to my wife's immunotherapies, each treatment of those two was $120,000.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard similar sort of stories around CAR T therapies and others. Yeah, it's just an amazing cost as well. That's being applied to these things, and it's something that we definitely need help as a country in terms of focus on it the right way. Sure, we want to innovate. Sure, we want to move faster. We want the greatest science at our fingertips, but paying much more than anywhere else in the world is a bit of a challenge that I think this country does need to struggle with a little bit more. Try and figure out.
Yeah, it just so happens that my daughter's husband, her grandmother-in-law, also had metastatic melanoma and underwent the exact same treatment. And it was less than $10,000 per treatment over there. So that's bothersome.
Yeah, I've described before, and I think I've done this as well on the podcast, that I've caught the flu in India several years back, had a temperature that kept climbing and climbing, was traveling with a group of people, separated from that group, and I stayed in the hotel, wound up going to the hospital. Well, I had 2 physicians, 4 nurses, a chest x-ray, and 8 prescriptions that I walked out of the hospital with. It cost me $8.26. And I know that I know all of the reasons why there may be that discrepancy. I can also walk my way through justifying it. However, I also think that there's just an opportunity to take a little deeper look at it as well.
Yeah.
And what excites you?
Wow. So just all of the innovation that's taking place. And when we talk about like the recent vaccines and mRNA, and you mentioned like gene and cell therapies and so on, I know we are just getting started. So that to me is like, when I think about the success of some immunotherapies and what's on the horizon with these other innovations, that keeps me going. It's incredible.
Yeah.
It really is incredible. And I was just reading today about a new gene therapy platform, and I'm like, this is happening. This is actually happening. And that really excites me. And I think given every sort of global experience around this pandemic, heightened awareness, and these new innovations coming out, and I think the speed at which these things do get out, arguably because of the pandemic, I think the future is bright.
Yeah.
I mean, I really believe that.
Yeah. It's funny because whenever I interviewed Jacob Glanville, one of the things we focused on was the virus, of course. And Jacob had just said, look, it doesn't all have to be bleak, Don. This is actually a really positive side to this, in that we now know that we can focus on this and treat these sort of things, and we can develop a path forward. It's great overall to hear that there are brilliant people like that. I'm happy that there are brilliant people like you that are working in this industry and using your knowledge and your background in terms of startups, and how do you leverage that and carry it forward. So with that, Tom Denison, I wanted to thank you for being a guest today on the podcast. Thank you so much for being here and spending time with me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Life Science Success. For complete details about this podcast, including show notes, how to get in touch with guests, and more episodes, please visit www.lifesciencesuccess.com. If there's someone you'd like for us to invite to the show as a guest, please let me know by sending me a message at the podcast website. Please click subscribe on your favorite podcast app, share the podcast, or tell a friend about it. And last but not least, rate the podcast. Thank you again.